I'm really honored to be here. Thank you. So I wasn't sure what to talk about actually, well up until shortly before coming to Japan, and I changed the title of this presentation a few times today as I was finalizing the slides. So I'm calling it Object Chemistry because there's a part of DCI that I didn't like and didn't want to accept for quite some time, and it wasn't until a short time ago that I really fully understood what it is. So I'll talk a little bit first about what DCI is, and we'll get into that. Have all of you at least read about DCI and have a basic understanding, or do I need to? Okay, so a little bit. All right. The general concept is that you have objects that need to do things, but they only need to do certain things in a given use, when you need to use them a certain way. So the canonical example, if you saw my presentation in Ruby Kaigi, is when you do a transfer of money from one account to another, you only need that ability when you are doing that transfer. But when you're doing other things with the account, you don't need it to exist on the account. And when we're thinking about objects, we tie identity and data and behavior together inside an object, but there's really nothing in object-oriented programming that says it always has to be that way. And we tend to think about initializing objects through classes, and because we do that, our classes contain all of the behavior. And so this can be kind of a challenging idea. So I call this object chemistry because the objects in our system interact with each other, and we gain value through their interaction. So they are not valuable in themselves just existing, but they only become valuable when we introduce other objects and other concepts in the system when they're interacting with each other. So I found a nice appetizing picture of ramen, and which to me makes me think about the chemistry when we eat. Each of these individual parts have certain flavors when you eat them individually, but when you combine them, they give you a completely different experience. And it made me think of Ratatouille. I don't know if you've seen this Pixar movie, but it's this mouse who loves food, and he's trying to explain to his brother, or sorry, a rat, trying to explain to his brother, another rat who doesn't care what he eats, what it feels like to eat one thing and eat another thing and then eat them together. And this, to me, is very much what a context is and how we define the interactions of objects. They only give us value when they're interacting with each other. We have separate concepts, and but it also makes me think about vinegar and baking soda and mixing those things together. I have 4 small children, and so this is a fun experiment to do. Each of these ingredients has some characteristics, but they don't do anything in particular for us that's exciting until we put them together with other things. And the objects in our system are the same way. So I think about chemistry when I think about the context that we're going to be talking about. And this is a role-based mental model. The roles that our objects play are determined by their environment, what they are inside their environment, but they're defined by their interaction. How an object interacts with another object or another bit of data defines its value to the system that you're building. So I want to talk a little bit about environments and how typically when we are working in object-oriented programming, we have a very strict view of what we have. And I didn't mention this at the beginning, but please interrupt. I'm used to a small meetup group at home, and we encourage interruption and discussion. So I'm eager for questions. And so we all know about global scope. What's that?
I keep forgetting. What does DCI stand for?
Oh, okay. DCI stands for data, context, and interaction. And our data objects are representations of things in the world, in our programming world. It's just information. It's the state of the system as it is. A context is a concept, but the idea in DCI is to turn it into an actual object, and the role of the context is to, or I should say the job of the context is to take these data objects and apply them to roles so that they can interact internally in the context. Right? So this context describes and sort of encapsulates the interaction between multiple data objects and the roles that they play. So the environments that we have in our system, we have global scope, and we're often told, probably more often than we actually experience it, that you should avoid global variables and global this and that is terrible. We have object scope, where we have instance variables that are only local to the object. We have method scope. Internally to a method, you may have local variables. And DCI sort of introduces this context scope. And this part I avoided for a long time. And what we tend to do in our programs is we pass around references. And I realized that DCI is a challenge to that. We don't necessarily need to pass around these references. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But this is kind of the way I see things. We have global environment, classes and constants. That's pretty much where they live. We may have namespacing, but generally you have access to them everywhere. Our instance environment, this is the object. It has instance variables and maybe other methods internally. And then our method environment has local variables. But there's this space here that most of us probably don't even realize is there. And this is where the instances know about each other. This exists in all of our programs. It's somewhere. But I know from my experience, it's never, in the past, it was never in a place that I could look to and see. But there are always places where we're managing dependencies, figuring out what objects should know about what other objects. And to me, DCI is a way to take some of that, at least there's always parts that are going to be on the outside, but some of that, and try to figure out how we can put it all together so that all of the related parts, all the related instances can interact, and all the information that they need is in that one place. They may interact in a different way somewhere else, or several other objects may come into interaction with ones here, but we can create this context environment where the variables and objects for a particular context, for a particular use case, are available. And this is kind of how I visualize it. This big gray circle is a context. So that's an object. And internally, it represents this inner working system of other objects. And there are things that happen outside of here that may have knowledge of the existence of this context, but we don't leak any of that outside. So these objects out on the left here don't know anything about what's happening inside the context. The context has its own interface. It has information about maybe its state. But internally, if this represents a use case, we can look inside this context object and see this is how these data objects are interacting. This is what happens when it succeeds. This is what happens when it fails. This is alternate outcomes for the things that we need. And externally, any other system only understands what the context provides in this API. Ruby fails at giving us real ability to do this. But most languages fail. I know when Jim Copeland was here, he talked a bit about Marvin, which was, it's an academic language that was written to support this idea. I don't believe anybody is actually using it, but it's an exploration of DCI in language design. I believe it's based on C++. Runa, the author of Marvin, also wrote or is working on a gem called Maroon that attempts to do DCI in Ruby, and I'm working my way through his code as well, trying to understand his code, trying to help him along. But I've been experimenting with my own things as well. But anyway, most languages can't actually do this, and I don't know of anybody who's attempting to use Marvin. I would love to hear it if any of you try. I haven't yet. But this is our environment. So we have this missing environment. We don't have this context scope, and we have multiple ways that objects interact in our system, but really no paradigm to represent them. And so anything that we can do in Ruby is currently kind of a hack, because the language doesn't support what we want it to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do, and we'll see how maybe some changes could happen either in Ruby or other languages as well. So this is a module and just defines this context method. And it stores, or it has access to this thread current variable, whatever is in context. And so we could take this module and we could include it in an object. It would now have a context method, and it would get this reference from thread current. So let's just kind of store that in our heads for a second. Here's another one. This is actually adapted from an existing project that attempted to explore DCI in Ruby. I think it's a Rails project as well. Victor Sapkin, he lives in Toronto, Canada, I think. I don't know the code well. I looked through it briefly, but I haven't worked on it. But it's an interesting project, and the decisions that they made are very similar to any of the other examples that you may find out there. You can include this module into a class, and it becomes a context, and it allows you to set thread current context to whatever variable you send in. And it has this in-context method, which essentially wraps a block, sets the context to self. So it's if you're initializing a class, that class will become the reference in thread current context. It yields and then sets it back to what it was previously. Now there's, I don't know, I didn't see Cope's presentation, but I know I've heard him many times talk about how an object lives on the heap in the program and the context lives on the stack, right? So this is essentially attempting to implement some sort of stack for context. We may have multiple ones, they may be nested, and as you go into them and out of them.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure.
What lives where?
An object lives on the heap, and a context lives on the stack. So this is an example from that DCI sample project. This bidding class, I think it's an auction application. This bidding class represents the interaction between a user who's bidding on something, the thing that he or she is bidding on, I guess information about the auction, some bid params, and I removed some code in here and just left it as comments, and there's a whole lot more in there. We can talk about what's here. On the top we have the initialize method, and when the objects come in through that method, they gain the ability through extend to do whatever it is they do, right? And these biddable and validator and bidder and other modules are local to the context. The context has these behaviors defined inside them. They're not used outside of this context. In my presentation at RubyKaigi, I mentioned you might even, if you're trying to implement this, you might even want to make those private constants. You probably don't need to, but it's the type of thing where Ruby's so powerful, you know, people argue, what if somebody monkey patches string to do some crazy thing, right? But that generally doesn't happen. So you could you could try this and find that you have a developer who just loves to grab your modules from all the contexts and use them in other places, but that's not a code problem. So anyway, these modules are all defined internal to the context. As the objects come in, they gain the ability to do certain things. And this, when we initialize this bidding context object, it will have this bid instance method. And you can see this in context block is what we saw in the previous slide that was defined, where it sets the context to the current object. So this bidding instance will be the context. It yields this block and then resets it back to what it was. What I don't like about this is that these objects inside this context, what we want to have, we have this missing scope that I talked about. We want to have this ability for these instances to know about each other. They're aware of each other's existence. Just like when we're in the global scope, we know classes exist, we know global variables exist. We don't have to do anything special to reference them. I'd really like to get away from having to wrap the method in this in context. And down below, there's a create bid method that's defined inside the biddable module. So we see this auction comes in up in initialize. It's extended with biddable, and it has this create bid method. And you can see that inside that method, it's getting access to things from the context. So this is where that in context block is setting something in the thread, right? We have this context object, and then it can get information. So these context bidder is what's being set up here. So add a reader, and they come in through here, and I pulled it out, but it would be there. And I don't like that either, because the object doesn't really know about what's around it. It has to go through this context object. I'd like to remove that. So this is a small change to what we had before. We had this context awareness module, which had a context method that returned current context and thread current. And if we add method missing, we can very easily say, all right, well, if I'm looking for a bidder or auction or whatever it may be, I'll just, if I don't know what it is, I will send it to the context and return that. So this gives objects an awareness of their surroundings by using that context. So down below, by making that change, we kind of free ourselves from thinking about this context object existing. We know it's there, but we kind of remove the need to have it be a mediator. We can think about defining this method, think about what a bidder is and what the request amount is without realizing that we have to go through this object, right? But I'd want to get rid of the in context block there as well. We didn't talk about that much, but up here I don't want to wrap that. We could do some define method magic, which I don't have a sample for. I'm actually working on some stuff and it wasn't working properly, so I decided not to show the code. But we can do some things that allow us to set the context automatically. I want to be able to just write my method and move on with it. And this shows to me that these objects that we're calling have a notion of what's around them. When I first started seeing example code that either Jim Copeland had written or someone else in Ruby, this was really odd to me, and I wanted to be able, if this create bid method needed access to those things, well, they should be passed in. Everything I ever do, I always pass those things in, because it kind of breaks that lexical scope of the method. And changing the way programs, or the way we think about scope, it's a really dangerous thing. It's kind of strange. But what I've realized is that because we have this notion of an environment, this context is a representation of the system of interacting objects, they really ought to know each other. They ought to know that the other objects exist internally, just like we have the same knowledge that another class might exist, or a global variable, or whatever it may be. So I'm kind of okay with that. And I want to talk a little bit about method lookup and what's missing from Ruby. And we'd actually need to change the language, I think, to really implement it. But this is what happens. It's an account example. It could very easily be any of the biddable auction items that we saw in the last one. But this is what happens when we send a message to an account object, for example. It goes through the account class, goes through the object class, kernel, and basic object until it finds the correct response, or the method that responds to the method. When we have a context, though, this is what we want to happen. Inside the context, the account gains these abilities, and we want any messages to first go through the role, right? Then after that, it can go through the rest of the hierarchy. And we get this with extend. But the problem is, when the object moves out of the context, it still has this. So we're changing the superclass hierarchy forever. There are gems out there. There's one called unmix, and I think mixable, and maybe it's just I don't know. But there's several gems out there that allow you to make this change. I think any ones that do this actually have C extensions, and so you may be locked out of using it in another implementation of Ruby. But if it's not really blessed by the language, I'd rather not really depend on it, because if the language changes, then all of a sudden you own that gem and you've got to make changes if the author abandons it. So we'll look a little bit at an alternate, which is here we have the account again, send a message to it, account in context. We could go through the entire superclass hierarchy. If it's not found, then come back to the role. This is actually what happens in casting, a gem that I just finished writing, or well, there's still work to be done on it, but that I released, that allows you to apply methods from a module using method missing. The problem with this is, as you can see, if there's a method that's defined in account or object, it will use that. So we can't change it. Whereas the idea behind refinements is we can actually change what those methods mean. And that's what we want in here. We want refinement just for an individual object, not an entire class of objects. We can, with casting, do this. We can call delegate whatever the role method is and pass in the role, but it requires that we do it manually. And the method lookup will go the way that we want it to. So there might be some ways that we can change that so that we maybe mark any of the methods that come from role to be first delegated and then sent out. But the benefit of that is that outside of context, the account goes back to the way it used to do things. So here's what's happening inside that gem. This delegating method yields a block, and at the beginning of the block, if there are any assignments, so we're saying take this, it's a hash, take this object and delegate to this module. It calls cast object and passes those in. There are methods that essentially call the same thing on the object itself and set the delegate module in a collection. I did a little bit of work here to make sure that if you're using forwardable or Rails or active supports delegation and you already have a delegate method defined, you can use one called cast. So it doesn't take over the delegate method unless you're not using it. But all it does is create this object here with the name that we want, passes in the reference of the object that we're going to be using as self. And it pretty much comes down to doing this. We find the delegated method, we bind it to the client, which is the self object that's passed in. And then we call it with whatever arguments we want. So this is the point that I want to get across in understanding DCI. We work with environments everywhere. We have our global environment, we have our instance environment, we have our method environment, but we don't have anything that allows us to think about a context of objects, a system of interacting objects. And we've locked ourselves into classes. A context is a very different thing, and when this idea is challenged, people seem to think about class-oriented programming, always going back to classes. And so this is a look at objects as they should be, focusing on their behavior and not on where they came from. And I think we should consider our roles in environments. The roles that our objects play inside our environments are really what's important to our system. What I want to do now, I put a bento box there because this to me looks like different context, but what I want to do is maybe dive into some code, talk about how we can maybe implement some of these things. I've experimented with re-implementing refinement-like behavior in casting. I'm actually in the process of adding to it. But I would really like to have a discussion about how this might apply to the systems that you're building. So, jump into that. Someone had written to me after I had released this gem a couple days ago. And had asked about doing something like refinements. So this was my very quick hack to get it working. Essentially, this block takes the same type of thing. Let me scroll down and show you what I'm doing. So,
Can I say?
Yeah.
Before diving into more code, I don't know if everybody's familiar with refinements. I'm not.
Oh, okay.
And I just had like a vague idea, and it sounded like, especially when I saw the initialize method where you just extend and add capabilities to your object just in that context. I'm like, isn't that exactly what refinements are about? And if it isn't, then what's the difference?
So refinements allows you, it's an experimental feature. It was, I think, going to be a core feature, but now you have to set a flag when you compile Ruby to enable it. As far as I heard at Ruby Kaigi, refinements is not going away. There have been a lot of people who are arguing that it should, that it's too difficult to implement or it's not well thought out. As far as I understand, it will become a core feature, and all the thinking that needs to be done will be done. But it allows you to, I think, in a class or in a module, define that, for example, all strings will behave this way. And a good example of that is active support. It adds a lot of things to strings or to hash or whatever it may be. But it monkey patches them. It adds them into every single string all over your system. And what refinements does is it says inside this class, every string will use these new abilities. So the stuff we're talking about with DCI is that we don't really want every instance of a class to have these new abilities. We want particular instances to have new abilities. So refinements is interesting in that regard, but it doesn't solve the problem of an individual object gaining new abilities. And for example, if we have 2 users, we don't want all users to now have certain abilities. We want one to play a certain role and another to play a different role. So that's actually, before I get into this, that's essentially what casting does. I'll go through the README here. The quick example of what I started doing when I started experimenting, I just wanted to delegate a method to another object. Mostly in Ruby 2.0, it's a module. But I wanted self to remain the actor here, the object that we're sending the message to. Whereas if you're using simple delegator or forwardable, you have 2 objects and 2 different selves. In this library, you don't. The object that you're sending the message to is always self inside the methods that are defined elsewhere. Yeah.
Out of interest, have you looked into the implementation of RSpec's expect method and also the mocking library double Ruby?
I have not.
Both of them have very similar APIs to this, meaning in RSpec originally they had the should syntax.
Mm-hmm.
So you add the method should to object and then you can run an assertion based on that. But quite recently, in late RSpec 2 and onto RSpec 3, they've decided that that dirties up the object. So what they've done is they've done something very similar to this, and they call expect in the DSL and add the object inside it, and then call their DSL methods. I think it's a very, very similar approach in many ways.
Let me see if I can find it. We can talk about it.
Not
You
so
would-
much the mocks, but it should be in
Oh, sorry.
core expectations. It should be in expectations, I think. Captain, you remember where expect is defined? Expect. Expect.
Expectations.
Yeah.
Expectation.
In the directory inside.
Expectations
Syntax.
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 Syntax. In syntax.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Everybody keeps saying that.
Somewhere down there, there should be an expect.
Oh, there.
Enable expect.
Yeah, something like that.
Alright, so it makes another object. We're going to be doing some code spelunking to get through to that. Expect target.
It sounds like a very similar approach to that method. I'm just curious. I haven't really looked that closely into it, but I guess it has the same weakness of not using self in probably the expectation definitions. So
That it's a separate object.
yeah, I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I guess they haven't discovered anything groundbreaking. But as a reference, it would be interesting to see.
Yeah.
But they're actually trying to popularize this particular syntax over the original syntax, which is fairly similar to the goals that DCI does have, in that just in this DSL we want to do X.
Right. Yes. I read a little bit. I don't know if Myron Marston.
Yeah,
read
that's
about
it.
it.
That's his blog.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely want to do that. And so this, when I started writing this, I wanted to provide just a simple interface, just this delegate method, which allowed you to take some other method from another object. In fact, when I went down this path, I built this based upon a bug in Ruby 1.9. I had no idea that it was a bug. I thought that maybe it might be, but what you can do in 1.9 is you can actually clone an object, extend the clone, and then pull any of the methods off of there. And applying them to the original object. So it sort of tricks the VM into thinking that this is an okay method to apply. Then I found out that Ruby 2.0 essentially blessed this idea that you could take a method off of any module and apply it to any object. And that's what's happening here. It's what you would do down below. This is a better example. Here, you just define a module that has this method, and it will call it with act as if it was defined on actor. But it allows you to pass in arguments as well if you need them in several different ways. Passing them in to delegate, creating a delegation object, and passing them in with, or just sending them to call. But this is essentially what we want here. So what I've done here in the gem proper, if you install it today, you can say this object internally inside this block will be delegating any methods defined on this module to that module. So it will take hello world off of that module, it will apply it to itself, call it, and then you can see before and after it raises a no method error. It doesn't understand what those methods are. So someone had asked me, could we do the same thing? Essentially, the code that I was going to show you works. It has this refining method. It's not in the gem, it's only in my examples directory. But you can pass in user class or person class or whatever it is, and then internally every instance of that class will have the ability to call the methods on that module. But this suffers from the problem that I was talking about before, where it has to go through the hierarchy of the superclasses first. And if that fails, then it will be applied to the object. But the way refinements works is that those refinements step in front of that hierarchy. It's the same thing as doing extend, essentially. So what I would really love to see in Ruby is the ability to do this, to say, I want to put this thing in front of all the method calls, and it's going to go through this first, but only in this location. Outside of this location, I don't want to have that in the superclass hierarchy. So I also this was actually one of the first things that I was working on. I saw you had posted about maybe thinking about rewriting forwardable using this, right? This was one of the first examples that I wrote. If you're not familiar with forwardable, it allows you to define, it has this delegate method, and you can pass in a collection of methods and say to what object or what method you'll call to send the message. And forwardable has the same problem as simple delegator. This is actually a separate object. But with casting, what we can do is this method could return a module or could return an object, whatever it is. But it would attempt to call these methods using itself, the instance of the object, as the representation of self inside the method elsewhere. So it was actually relatively simple. There's a lot of other things inside forwardable, but this is all I had to do. I just had to define a method. I already have this delegate method defined. And maybe I can bring up this forwardable. So here's forwardable. What you do is you extend it with a forwardable module, and then you have this def delegator. This is sort of the opposite direction. When you use this method, it says, tell me what to forward to, and then what methods to send to. So if I call a record number on this record collection, it will forward it to its collection of records. But there's other examples. This is out of date. Zach going to fix this if he saw his presentation in Ruby Kaigi. He fixed that live. So I have this out of date. But the syntax that I chose for my example here is this exact syntax. There, you can pass in a collection of method names and as the key. If you don't know, Ruby arrays can actually, hashes can actually use an array as a key. So this is a hash, and the value is here in forwardable. It's a method. So you'd be sending it to whatever object you return from that method, and the same goes for this. It would still be a method, but you could, for example, alter it to change to a different module or whatever it may be. But I have the caveat here that forwardable actually marks an object to always send these messages. And my goal with casting was to only when I want to apply these methods from another object. So there's probably other things that could be done here. If you didn't see my presentation in Ruby Kaigi, one of the things before doing the presentation as I was preparing, I thought, well, why will people find this valuable? And I had that argument about, multiple objects, and when you use a wrapper, you actually send a message to the wrapper, not to the object that you care about. So casting helps you solve that problem by just sending to the message you care about, or sending to the object that you care about. And I started looking through here, and I thought, well, this is what we are generally doing, creating simple delegators. What in here would I need? Could I re-implement this using casting? And I looked through and found that there's not a single method in here that I would still need. Because everything inside of this, there's a whole lot of complexity, a lot of good thought, making sure things work reasonably well. All it is doing is making sure that messages are sent to the other object. This Marshall dump, it gets the other object and gets all the instance variables. Marshall load, it sets them on the other object. Initialize clone, it gets the other object. So a lot of the stuff that happens inside here has to do with not the one that you care about, or taking the wrapper and having it apply behavior to another one. So someone asked me on Twitter, could we do refinements? And it was relatively easy to do. I stayed up too late working on it, but it was surprisingly easy. I'm currently working on making the API, building the API into the gem, so you can do this. But this refinements file is just my quick hack in getting it to work. So these objects are created inside of this block. Any instance of user has the ability to say hello, which is defined up there in the module, and then outside of it, it raises a no method error.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's simple example, but as you know, in business application, loading object is big matter. So loading object is one of the business logic. One of the business logic things. So as you know, query to the database is big business logic. So it's a simple case. So you show the simple new method, using new method to create the object. But I think creating object is big matter. So who load the data, the DCI context?
In DCI, there's no opinion about where the object should come in, right? If you choose to make it the context responsibility, and maybe you just pass in an ID, then that's your choice, that's your architectural decision. Or if you want to initialize that object externally and send it in, you can do that. So the idea in DCI is essentially this block. Inside the block, inside the context, objects can do things and they can interact. Outside of it, they don't have those same behaviors. And so if you want, if I wanted to initialize these in here,
Mhm.
that would work just fine.
Mhm.
If I want to do it outside, it's just a personal preference or the needs of my system. If I have to optimize in a certain way, it doesn't matter. As long as I keep the focus of the interaction defined inside of the context and that it doesn't leak out.
I had a thought along very similar lines. I was going to ask you, so with your business objects, do you inherit active record base?
When I first started doing this, yes. And only because I was implementing it in existing systems. I know Data Mapper 2 has had a lot of work, and I just named it to Ruby Object Mapper, ROM, I think is the name of the gem now, which gives you a totally different way of doing it. Fred Wu created Data Mapify, I think is the name of it. There's lots of different options. The thing I love about Rails is that very early on they decided you could choose your own ORM. So I have used it with Active Record, I have used it without Active Record, and there are certain niceties about having Active Record. For example, when you define your classes of things in a typical Rails app and you're using Active Record, having belongs to and has many and has one and that type of thing gives you a view of the state of the system, the interaction, or sorry, the relationship between objects, which I find to be very valuable because you know these things are related and they're always related. I'm not sure about whether or not they should only gain the ability to have some sort of relationship internal to a context, or if they always have that relationship. I think that's a difficult decision. But I've used it with Active Record, I've used it without, and it's not a hindrance. It certainly is a lot of code and a lot of behavior, and many people dislike Active Record for that reason, but it doesn't really have, you can apply it. So, did that answer the question, or is there?
Well, that was a helpful reply, but in addition to that, I was curious as to how often you've used it with plain old Ruby objects as opposed to active record objects. So perhaps treating active records just the data's just for data access, and then separating it out. Because if you separate it out, it makes things cleaner. But on the other hand, as you just mentioned, it takes away your relationships.
Right.
Right. And if you want to rebuild the relationships, I think it's a big step. So there's more to it than DCI if you take that route.
There's going to be more to any program if you take that route, regardless of DCI. So I don't know that I'll have a good answer.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if I'm wondering if you've actually gone through that route, because I haven't.
I've gone through the path of storing an internal reference. So I've used Active Record because I've already had an existing application, and I store an internal reference to the record. I store an @record instance variable, and have a plain old Ruby class initializing my objects, right? So I might have the record pull data, and then internally I'll pull that data into the
like
object.
an aggregate object.
Essentially, yes. Yeah. So I've used it like that. What I tend to do, I started, just pull this over, I started hacking together this project management app, right? And I thought, well, what I wanted to have here, this is essentially pseudocode. There's some stuff in here that doesn't work. I'm just quickly hacking on it. But what I tend to do is I will start with my context, and I will define my objects' roles, and I'll define how they interact, and then from there go and implement the objects that I want, right? So what I started thinking about was there are a lot of project management tools that allow you to assign tasks to developers. And I've found that to be a serious problem with management when some project manager says, you're going to be doing this task and you're going to be doing that task. And if any of you have worked with Scrum, for example, as a team, you get together and you select your tickets. And so I decided, all right, I'm going to make one that has volunteers. So we have a bunch of work that needs to be done. And the only way you can get this workload is for you to volunteer to do it. So I just started throwing this together. It's about task selection, and the volunteer can select a task, they can abandon a task, or they can just watch a task. And so I'm starting to think through, what does all that mean? None of this is really implemented. I created this notifier class, and it has these methods, but only so that it wouldn't fail. But I'm kind of loading it and thinking through it as I go. And this, I'm not TDDing it, because this is the code, this is the interaction, this is the system that I want to see. It's okay that I don't, that a particular method doesn't return a certain thing. I'm not thinking about developing the system from the smallest bits first. I'm thinking high-level view, what's actually going to be happening. To give you a little bit of information, a user will trigger something in a use case. And so I started defining this trigger method. What this does is defines a method on the context object, and it uses this block. But what I'm trying to do, where I mentioned this in my presentation, is I'm going to try and use some define method magic here, so that I can set the current context at the beginning, run the block, and then set it back to what it was before if it had a value. Likewise here, what I'm doing with this setup is doing the initialization, where if I'll be able to call new, and if this defines the initialize method, if I have a task module, it will extend this object, or it will use casting, cast it as, or whatever I want. If I have a volunteer module, it'll automatically apply it. If I have a site module, it'll automatically apply it. So that's why you see up above I have this volunteer. So when this is initialized, it will set an instance variable to volunteer, it sets an add a reader for volunteer, and it extends it with this volunteer module. So doing this type of thing allows me to just think about what's going to be happening. This is a use case. What I really care about for this project is that a user can volunteer for a task. So what's going to happen then? And this is what I love about DCI, that I can do this type of stuff. All of this is in one place. I do not yet care about controllers. I don't yet care about whether or not I'm using Active Record, or if I'm using Data Mapper, or any sort of storage mechanism. In fact, I have this scenario, which is essentially a task, and when I get all the scenarios, I'm just returning a new one. Like, I don't yet care. I have no database backend behind this. My user is just a struct, and when I get all of them, I call find, and there we go, there's a new one. So I can work through it, and I can think through it, actually having running objects if I open up the Rails console or something like that. And I don't have to implement any of my storage stuff yet. So,
what's the advantage of doing that in the volunteer context instead of just doing this in the controller? Like, you could do similar behavior with user and making fake user and whatnot in a controller. And I guess I'm just seeing you doing stuff like you have some notifier, so you're creating some notification, you have a site go-to task. Like, this to me kind of seems very similar what would normally be in your Rails controller, but
right.
What's different in here?
I like the convention of keeping Rails controllers in the index, show, create, edit.
Mm-hmm.
I try to maintain all those. These behaviors for the volunteer may not all go through the same controller. For example, when you write an update method for some record, you might check for a parameter inside your controller and do one thing, and then if that parameter's not there, or if it's some other value, you do another thing. I've written
model
code.
it that way, right?
What's
you
that?
could model it in a way that you would have a So if you just think in terms of resources, I guess that's what we're trying to do, is thinking in terms of resources. So here you would have, how we would call this, maybe a
Volunteering for a task.
volunteering resource or something like that. So you have a create, you have a delete, you have an update on that, and that handles basically that resource. Even if you don't represent that as objects, like how that is represented in the databases, I get a different beast.
Right.
Yeah. And of course we have some cross-cutting stuff, I guess, in there, but I guess that's how we would currently approach this.
So
It's
your
just
volunteering
resource-based.
would be an object that is essentially factory.
No, it would be more a controller, and the controller is basically representing a resource, right? And I guess we would have actually two. I guess the watch would be somewhat different.
Right. So
that would be probably a task watch, because that could be like independent whether you're volunteering or not.
So, but it's related, right?
I mean, you could also argue that's maybe not related to whether you're volunteering or not, because you just want to watch. So maybe a manager also wants to watch. Anyway, so I guess just modeling it in that way, and then basically have the controllers just interact with the models that they need.
You could certainly do that. So the argument behind DCI is not that you can't do it another way.
Okay, I guess we're not arguing that. It's just like maybe the thing is like which one is.
Or what's the
Or
difference
what's
of
the
this approach? What are the advantages?
So the value to me is that I know that I'm thinking in terms of what this volunteer is doing, and I'm keeping all that related behavior in the same place. So as far as I understood, you're talking about potentially having another model that represents the volunteering, and maybe the controller, and then another one that does something else. But to me, in my domain, these things are all related, right?
I can totally see I think if you're now drilling into the different things, so that's maybe the stuff that you're not showing there, but basically the volunteer, I guess, would have different methods that are maybe not necessary outside of that context, but that are available within the, for instance, in the notifier, that are usually maybe not available. So in that case, I can kind of see, I think that it starts to make more sense if you're looking at more complex code.
Yeah.
Where suddenly, even in like if you're like then like drilling down into the object hierarchy, and basically have the objects like interact with each other, and have those methods that you need in there.
Yes. So let's say, I mean, I'm trying to avoid bureaucracy in this, right? I want people to volunteer rather than having somebody tell you something. But let's say the notifier required that your manager approve that you get notified or approve something like that. This could be another context where all that interaction is defined, and it can be used here, but maybe another place where we need notification it's used as well. And so you might play the same role in there from another place. In DCI, you know, if this is a representation of a context, there's nothing that says that this can't initialize and call another context, or some other one can't initialize this and call it. But this represents the procedures that we want to happen when a user triggers something, right? So if a user is triggering the fact that they're selecting a task, or they're watching it, or they're abandoning it, I have all of that here, because this is what I'm going to sit down with the business owner and talk about, well, what's supposed to actually happen, and they will understand it in terms of procedure. Well, this happens, that happens, and this other thing happens, right?
Okay.
But you didn't use the notifier, I guess it's not in there, right?
No, the implementation of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's essentially just a mailer right now. So
Yeah.
I
But that
literally,
should be also in there, right?
I literally started writing this afternoon. So
Okay, in this example, the site go-to task, what does that?
this is something I'm still working through, but what
It's kind of cross-cutting, right?
it's when these things happen, we want the user to end up at a certain place, and that's an important thing. I know not everybody thinks like this, but I really value this because I was on a project that we had lots of state machines our different objects had state machines, and it was really difficult to understand when something went into this state and moved to that state, where was it supposed to end up? And we would have bugs where we had things defined in the controllers, and what I really want here is that if this is defining all of my business procedures, I want to know when the user does certain things, where do they end up next? And so when I initialize this, I will pass a controller in as a listener. So it has essentially